Hi, good evening, everyone. Welcome to this event. I am Emma Graham Harrison. We will be live online for an hour. For about the first 30 minutes, I'll be talking to Elif Shafak, who I'm going to introduce properly in a second. And after that, we'll take some questions from you. Thank you to everybody who's already sent us questions. We've got those, and we'll also be including those in the Q&A. In terms of people who want to do questions during the talk, there's a Q&A function on your screen, which is to the right of this window. You can either choose to be anonymous or use your name, but please try to keep them as short and concise and relevant to the discussion as possible. So I am very, very excited and honoured to be here tonight with Elif, here virtually, all together in person, but with Elif Shafak, who's a novelist, essayist, and public intellectual. She's incredibly prolific. She's written 17 published books. The one we're discussing is the 17th, and she has her 18th out this month. She's Turkish, but has lived around the world, both as a child and as an adult, and now calls London her home. The power of her work is recognised by her many readers and fans in the literary world. The novel that we're talking about tonight was nominated for a Booker. She has over 1 million followers on Twitter. Her TED Talks have been watched by over 5 million people. But I think the power of her work has also been recognised by another group who maybe wouldn't classify themselves as fans, and those are the authorities who she frightens. She's been put on trial for insulting Turkishness after writing about the Armenian genocide. And more recently, she's been investigated for obscenity because of passages or parts of her work tackling sexual abuse of children, sexual violence against women. It's, of course, a pretty bitter tribute, as it's forced Shafak into a kind of exile. But I think that level of official fear of her work is also testament to its incredible power. So I'm truly honoured to be here today and really delighted that so many of you have chosen to join us. And do forgive me if I start peering at my screen at various points. Like everybody, I'm working from home and my questions and things are on my computer. So my first question is quite a general one. We're here to discuss 10 minutes and 38 seconds in this strange world, your brilliant book that came out last year. And one of the things that really struck me about it is that it should have been incredibly bleak. I don't want to get into spoilers or too many spoilers for people who are still looking forward to reading it, but it's about a sex worker who's brutally murdered. It touches on a lot of very painful topics, including child sex abuse and sort of long reverberations through people's lives, the trafficking of women, discrimination and exclusion, the shadow of the Armenian genocide, discrimination against Yazidis even. It begins with the death of its beautiful main character. So, you know, I was expecting a brilliant book, but I was also braced for quite a painful one. And yet, despite all of the difficult things it looks at, I found it not just moving, but actually uplifting in its portrayal of sort of the redeeming power of love, of friendships, what you describe as sort of the water families that we choose for ourselves instead of, or as well as blood families, and the power of a life lived honestly, even when that is a very painful choice. And I just wondered, did you intend it to be this kind of book, or did you start out writing something bleaker and sort of the main character, you know, this wonderful Tequila Lila, did she change what the book was as you were writing? I'd just sort of be interested to know sort of how it began, the writing process, and what you envisaged the book and what it was actually like.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the question. I also, it's really nice to have this conversation together, Emma. I think it was Istanbul itself that inspired me to write in this way, because when you live in the city or when you observe the city, you realize everything is constantly mixing, the good and the bad, the sad and the funny. And there are moments when you detect such melancholy, even in moments of joy and happiness. You know, it's all there. There are always layers upon layers in Istanbul. So I thought, that kind of story could only be written in a dialectical way, like sorrow. I'm interested in the ways in which sorrow talks to humor. I think humor is very important, even more so for countries that have lost their democracy or appreciation of diversity. Humor is the way, is our oxygen, is the way we breathe. I like humor very much. not the kind of humor that looks down upon people, but the kind of humor that has compassion in it. And so if you tell the story of Istanbul, I think, of course, there's room for sorrow and melancholy, but there must be room for humor. And also, it's a very dynamic city. It's constantly throbbing with energy and moving, restless. And I think I wanted to reflect that as well. And it matters a lot to me that you said it's an uplifting book. I hoped it was an uplifting book because, yes, it does deal with very dark subjects, including sexual abuse. Also, the theme of death itself is not an easy subject to talk about. And yet I hoped when the readers reached the last page, maybe, something positive could have stayed with them.
Well, I mean, it certainly did for me, and that was, yeah, something I sort of wasn't expecting. Another thing about the book, I mean, in terms of your wider work, you've been sort of warning for a long time about the dangers of tribalism, about sort of demagogues who peddle an illusion of certainty, whether they're sort of nationalist right-wingers or religious extremists. Warnings that unfortunately have come to seem very prescient in recent years. And it felt in many ways that this book was a sort of manifesto for the world that people like that want to destroy, or the world that challenges them, people who live their lives as individuals who are true to themselves rather than sort of primarily identifying themselves as sort of members of a group. And I just wondered, was that sort of intentional? I mean, was that aspect of the story something that came out of your sort of political writing, your position as a public intellectual, or is that something that just sort of holistically came out in the book as a reflection of your own values and interests?
I think they're all interconnected. Our thoughts, our observations. For me, writing is not necessarily autobiographical. It never has been that way. I have a lot of respect for people who see literature in a more autobiographical way, but that wasn't my starting point. For me, what was more interesting was to try to transcend the limits of the self that was given to me by birth, to try to see how the truth looks like if I were able to put myself in the shoes of another person. So that kind of cognitive flexibility is something that I care about. But I think it is true that you mentioned politics, because overall, when we observe countries that have lost their democracy, that have been going backwards, it is not a coincidence that we also see an intolerance towards difference. If you happen to be different in the eyes of the authorities for whatever reason, or if you happen to be different in the eyes of the society, again, for whatever reason, this could be the color of your skin, it could be your sexual identity, it could be how you look physically, anything, your political views. If you are different, then your life is going to be difficult. And so for me, I think it has always been important to try to give more voice to people who have been pushed to the periphery, marginalized, rather than the center. It is the periphery that always has been closer to my heart. And I think literature needs to pay attention to those silences. Of course, as writers, we always chase stories, but I'm equally interested in silences and those who have been silenced. So that comes to me almost as an instinct. And that's why both the story evolved in that way, but also I think my own perception of the world always tries to pay more attention to those who have been disempowered and pushed to the margins.
And just sort of talking a bit about the sort of structure of the book and the title. I mean, the 10 minutes, 38 seconds, I think that comes from medical research, right, into that found that the brains of at least one patient that was monitored after he died continued to show, or she died perhaps, continued to show some signs of activity for that time period. And I was just wondering, did you read about the research and that somehow inspired the book, or did you already have the book in your mind and you read about the medical research and sort of thought this is what I need for the structure, or how did that sort of fit into the process of writing?
Yes, I was very intrigued. All these medical studies that show after the moment of the death, after the heart has stopped beating, the human mind can remain active for another few minutes. And sometimes, particularly in a study in Canada, they have observed that activity can go on for about 10 minutes. And to me, as a novelist, that was an amazing puzzle. If it is true that the part of our brain that is in charge of long-term memory is the last bit to shut down, then what do the dead remember? What happens inside the human mind in that limited amount of time? And if we remember the past, how do you compress an entire life into just a few minutes? In a way that gave me the entire structure of the novel. As you said, the main character, we do know on the first page actually that she's dead, but as she keeps remembering her past minute by minute, I think we travel not only into her story, but also the story of a country, the story of a region, always told through the eyes of the marginalized. So those studies were incredibly motivating for me. But also, in addition, an actual place was inspiring. And that was my second starting point. This is a graveyard in Istanbul. It really exists on the outskirts of Istanbul. In Turkish, we call it Kimsesizler Mezarlığı, which means the graveyard of people who don't have a companion, who don't have anyone in life. And I've been to this place several times in the past, and it always moved me deeply because it's unlike any other graveyard. There are no tombstones there, no marble stones, no names, surnames, no flowers, no visitors, only wooden posts with numbers scribbled. And I started doing research. It's very difficult to find information about people who have been buried there because due to the weather, snow or wind, if the numbers disappear, everything disappears. You have no way of knowing who is buried there. And so I started reading, collecting information from local newspapers. And then you realize most of the people who have been almost dumped there without a funeral or a proper burial, they have been shunned by their families. Because according to the law, if your family does not reclaim your body, then you end up in the cemetery of the companions. So there are lots of LGBTQ members, sexual minorities there. There are also some sex workers, there are suicides, there are abandoned babies, and the growing number of refugees. We always read in newspapers about refugees who have drowned as they were trying to cross into Europe. But where are the bodies taken? They're taken to the cemetery of the companions in Istanbul. So it's a very sad place where an Afghan refugee or a Syrian refugee might be buried next to a Kurdish sex worker or a Turkish transgender citizen, and they're all there without names. That was the second thing that motivated me. I think my instinct was to try to reverse the process. The cemetery takes human beings and turns them into numbers. And I think as a writer, I want to take at least one of those numbers and try to rehumanize someone who had been dehumanized in that way.
How did you first end up at the cemetery? I mean, it doesn't sound like a place that you would end up in by accident or, not on a sort of, city guide normally.
Yeah, it is a place that you wouldn't find on a city guide. But I think the places where Tequila Leila in the book, she lived, those are places you wouldn't find in a city guide either. These are not the places. That's why at some point in the book it says the Istanbul that Leila lived was not the Istanbul that the Ministry of Culture would have wanted foreigners to see. This is a different Istanbul. It's the underbelly, And I think partly I was inspired by my own years in Istanbul. I lived on a street called Kazancı, the street of cauldron makers, which is very close to Taksim Square, and it's in one of the most cosmopolitan neighborhoods in Istanbul. And even the history of that street would tell you so much about the city itself, with all its conflicts and tragedies, because this is a place that was mostly heavily populated by ethnic minorities, mostly by Armenians, Jewish families, and Greek families. But many of them were left. They didn't feel welcomed anymore. They didn't feel comfortable anymore or safe, And then in 1970s, sexual minorities moved in. They lived there for a while, but then they were driven out after the coup d'etat, mostly by force. In 1990s, feminists moved in, maybe bohemian artists moved in. Many of them left. But when you go to that place, you feel like nothing is solid in this city. It's like a boat and we are passengers in this place. However, when I moved to that city, I had an old Armenian neighbor, I had an old Jewish neighbor, I had a middle-aged transgender neighbor. It was almost like from every cluster of passengers, someone had remained, like remnants of the past. And all of that moved me a lot. I was there on the night of the earthquake. This was a big earthquake, around 10,000 people died. And when we ran out in the middle of the night, I never forget that moment. There was a ultra-conservative grocer who never said hi to sexual minorities, who never spoke to liberals, who never sold leftist newspapers, who never sold alcohol. He was extremely, religious. And I saw him on the night of the earthquake, opening a pack of cigarettes and offering it to my transgender neighbor, and she was crying, her mascara was leaking, and the two of them smoking side by side. It's just ingrained in my memory, you never forget. But the next morning, again, he wasn't talking to her, but just for a few hours in the face of death, because we were all scared of death because of the earthquake, all those differences evaporated. And I think Istanbul is full of such stories.
Was he by any chance the template for the grocer that Layla avoids in the book?
I think he inspired the grocer in the novel, very much so.
I wanted to ask you a broader question now about your writing, and particularly the shift from Turkish to English, which I know was quite a while ago now. I think the first book that you wrote in English first and then translated back into Turkish rather than writing in Turkish and translating into English was The Saint of Incipient Insanities, which is several books ago now. But it just, you wrote, I think I was reading something from a while ago, you were talking about that, how you enjoy the fact that English has more room for irony, that you like the sort of magpie vocabulary that we have in English, sort of collected from so many different languages and traditions. But it feels like as a writer, language is sort of part of your art. It's not like, say, being a journalist using another language where it's just a tool. And shifting from writing in Turkish to writing in English seems to me, I don't know, analogous to maybe a visual artist going from painting to sculpture, a big leap, which obviously some people do brilliantly, but also some people maybe don't. And I was just curious about sort of what pushed you to sort of, I know you used English in your working life sort of as an academic. In your public life, you were living in the US, but what pushed you to sort of shift your art from Turkish to English? Do you ever think you might go back to writing primarily in Turkish, or is English now more your language of creation?
Yeah, I really find this question so important, and it's one that I keep thinking about all the time. As I was listening to you, I was thinking about the Palestinian poet Mahmoud Darwish. He used to define language as his homeland, and I understand, and you can't abandon it in that regard. On the other hand, I think it is also possible to dream in more than one language, and in fact, our minds do that. I'm not claiming that it's easy. Actually, it is tough. I'm an immigrant, I'm a latecomer, and English for me is an acquired language. So like many immigrants, I do feel this gap between the mind and the tongue. The mind always runs faster, and your tongue, in a very clumsy way, is trying to catch up. I think as immigrants, we always want to crack better jokes. We always want to be able to say a bit more, but end up with a bit less. And that is a bit frustrating, but at the same time, it could be maybe motivating. It sometimes pushes you or encourages you to pay more attention to nuances. My own journey with the English language started around the time I was 10, 11 years old, not before that. I was in Spain at the time, so English was my third language. Spanish was my second language. But what happened with the English language is it stayed with me. It never abandoned me. And I kept writing poems, short stories in English, but I would always keep them to myself. So making that leap didn't come easily, but it was almost like an animal instinct for me. Maybe at some point as an author, I felt a bit suffocated. And being Turkish is a bit heavy. Writing about Turkish subjects is a bit heavy too. And writing in English gave me another zone of existence and maybe gave me an additional freedom. So I like that cognitive distance. I needed that cognitive distance. It's a bit like When you want to see a painting better, you don't get closer, you take a step back. And I realized when I write in English, actually, I'm able to take a closer look at where I come from with all its layers. So it brought me closer, not further far away. That said, I think to this day, I realize if my writing has sadness in it, if it has sorrow, melancholy, longing, loss, I find all these things much easier to express in Turkish. But when it comes to humor, which I adore and find very important, when it comes to irony and particularly satire, it's much easier in English. In Turkish, we don't even have a word for irony. We don't do irony.
Wow. Sort of following up to that, we had a question from actually someone in the audience that might fit with it, from Anahita, who asked, when you're supervising the translation of your novels back into Turkish, do you ever change them, cutting bits or expanding on parts even for a Turkish audience, or do you try to have them as similar as possible to the English edition?
So what happens is each novel is translated into Turkish by a professional translator. And I'm very grateful to the people I work with. I think we also have to add that as writers, we're always indebted, grateful to our translators. I know some books that are much better in the translated form rather than the original form, because the translator has done wonders. So I'm very much aware of that creative process. I cannot translate myself for a couple of reasons, because it's a completely different creative work, and I don't have that ability. But also, secondly, because I would change the story a lot. You always want to change the story. You always want to add more, take pieces. So it's good that you're working with someone who keeps an eye on you. But what happens is when the translation is over, then I take it and change the vocabulary a little bit, because people who read me in Turkish, they would know I use both old words and new words. And this is a very big issue in Turkey. Usually, if you're a liberal, if you're not conservative, you're not expected to be interested in old words, which I've never understood. I've never understood this distinction between old words and new words. As you know, Turkey was once, what we're talking about is in the Ottoman Empire, it was a mixture of lots of different dialects, languages, ethnicities. As a result, the language, the syntax was Turkish, but the vocabulary itself was a mixture. When we Turkified the language, around 45% of the vocabulary was taken out, which means in Turkish I can say yellow and I can say red, but for the shades in between, I have no words, because they were old words and they have been taken out because they used to come from Persian. So I've always been critical of that. As a writer, I need both old words and new words. I want all the words, And when I hear you speak English and you use words like chutzpah, or you use words like kismet, and nobody says, wait a minute, let's take the former because that's a Jewish word, and let's take the latter because that's an Arabic word. It shouldn't be in the English language. Nobody says that. They're all part of the English language. I like that. There's a part of me that appreciates that. So I do play with the translation a little bit, in the sense that I add both old words and new words into the vocabulary of the Turkish translation.
And just, sorry, a very small question. I'm fascinated. All those 45% of missing words, are they still used in everyday life? I mean, if people want to talk about, orange or, amber or whatever, are they still using these old words, or are they really disappearing entirely from Turkish?
Many of them have disappeared. Some of the older words have remained, but then people who are either older or more conservative would use them. And I've never understood that political distinction. For me, words live longer than human beings. Their lifespan is much older, and I think it should be organic. We need to respect their own flow, and we need nuances in order to be able to express ourselves in a more nuanced way. So rather than taking words out, I would rather expand our vocabulary. That to me feels like a better way forward. And I've always struggled with that. Just to give you an example, if you look at an Ottoman dictionary, it is quite thick. If you look at the modern Turkish dictionary, it's almost half the size, and that will give you an idea about how many words we have lost along the way.
Just returning a bit to the book and particularly to Layla's death, actually, there's been a campaign recently on Instagram of sort of, as it circulated in the West, of quite sort of vague female solidarity, women sharing black and white photos of themselves to sort of, in some abstract way, sort of show solidarity with other women. It was presented as a challenge, and it sort of emerged after this had been going around for a few days. For those in the audience who haven't seen this, that the actual origin of this campaign was Turkey, and it had actually, the reason that women were being encouraged to share a black and white photo was that it was a campaign against femicide, against killing of women, and it was meant to be a memory of the victims of these murders who appeared in newspapers, who were dead. All that was left of them were articles in newspapers where they appeared in black and white. And I just sort of would be interested really to know your thoughts both on the campaign, and also it seems quite sort of sad and indicative of our times in a way that a campaign that was so urgent and so rooted in a very specific problem became completely disconnected from that and became a rather sort of vague and purposeless sort of feel good kind of Western, largely white, feminist kind of campaign here, when solidarity is so needed, and a more sort of focus on the original goal might have been more helpful.
Yeah, I fully hear you. I think there are a couple of things going on there. First of all, of course, Turkey has been going backwards, first gradually and then with a bewildering speed, in the sense that we have seen an increase in nationalism, an increase in religiosity, an increase in populist right, populist nationalism, and also an increase in authoritarianism. Now, when that happens, it is not a coincidence that sexism also increases. Patriarchy is also consolidated. Homophobia also increases. I don't think that's a coincidence. They always go hand in hand. So we have a government that is not only ultra-conservative and ultra-nationalist and authoritarian, for sure, but also incredibly patriarchal. Just to give you an example, just last year, they tried to pass this bill. They dropped it for the moment, but probably they're going to bring it up again. This idea that the sentence given to rapists could be reduced. I'm talking about rapists of underage victims. Their sentence, their punishment could be reduced if they agreed, should they agree to marry their victims, as if the rapists are doing their victims a favor. Why? For the legislators who come up with this disgusting idea, what really matters is an abstract notion of honor, whether it's family honor or tribal honor. They do not care about the well-being of the victims. They do not realize that they're punishing the victims to a lifetime of rape. So that's the mentality that you have to deal with. In Turkey, we have seen an alarming increase over the years in cases of domestic violence and gender violence. And I'm giving you the statistics that even the ministry itself had to announce at some point. When I say the ministry, this was a women's rights ministry, but they changed the name, they made it family ministry. But in the last 10 years, the increase in cases of domestic violence is 1,400%. This is a country in which 1 out of every 3 marriages involves an underage girl, a child bride. And also we have seen an increase in child brides also with the refugees, because many refugee families want their daughters to get married at an earlier age, thinking it will be better for them. So a tremendous increase in the number of child brides as well. All of that is very urgent, it's very alarming. And while that is happening, the government is trying to withdraw from the Istanbul Convention, which it was the first country to sign in 2013. Istanbul Convention is incredibly important. This is the first international standard that protects women's rights, children's rights, but also sexual minorities' rights, and makes sure that nobody is abused and mistreated. So for us, it's very vital to keep this convention alive. And that's why Turkish women are protesting. They're on the streets right now. and all these social media campaigns are being launched, because in a couple of days, the government is going to reach a decision. If I may add this, not on the same level, but something similar is happening in Poland, and something similar is happening in Hungary. Again, it's not a coincidence that wherever we see an increase in authoritarianism or going backwards from democracy, we see populist demagogues attacking women's rights and the rights of sexual minorities. This is the first thing they do. So I think it's very crucial, this crossroads that we have. And it's very important when we honor these social media campaigns that we do not forget why they were started, initiated in the first place.
So thank you so much. We've got to half an hour now, so although I still have lots of questions of my own, I'm going to open up to some that we've had from the audience. I might just start with one, sort of coming back to the book. We had a question from Christine, who was asking about the passage where is it Nalan? I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it right. Nalan compares sort of how religion and politics are used, like the hood that's placed over the head of falcons when they're being trained to sort of bring obedience. And she asks, in your view, can religion ever be anything other than an oppressive force? For me personally, I just wanted to add one sort of thought. I felt like in Zainab you had an example of how religion can be very beautiful and a sort of positive force. You had that sort of counterbalance there. So it'd be interesting to, just get your take on sort of religion as a force in the world.
Thank you. I think before answering, if I may say this, I like it when writers ask questions without trying to, guide their readers in one direction or the other. I don't like books that preach or try to teach something. It's not up to me, and I don't know the answers myself oftentimes anyhow. But I find it very important that writers be able to raise the questions, ask the questions, including difficult questions about difficult issues, and open up spaces, open democratic spaces where we can hear a diversity of voices. So in this regard, I like it when faith and doubt challenge each other. In many of my books, they talk to each other and they challenge each other. I think I'm very critical of certainty, personally. I don't like it when people are very certain of their truths. And my problem with religious people is that they want to get rid of doubt. And I think faith without doubt is a dogma, and dogmas are incredibly dangerous. But sometimes absolute atheism can also be very certain of its own truths. And this time you want to get rid of faith. Whereas I personally, I think I feel closer to agnostics. Agnostics who have been maybe a little bit more humble in the sense that the journey is still going on. I think I do make a distinction between religion and spirituality. I'm not a religious person. I'm not even a believer. And I have a problem with organized religions. I don't like the way organized religions divide humanity into us versus them and hold this conviction that somehow us is better than them or closer to God than them or somehow more worthy of paradise than them. None of that is close to my heart. But I'm interested in individual spiritual journeys. And those journeys are unique. They're just like our fingerprints. And who am I to judge someone else's individual journey? You might start that journey as a Buddhist, you might end up as a Jewish agnostic, or vice versa. So all of those paths are very individual, very inward looking. And there's a part of me that appreciates that. And I think in general, on the left, we haven't been able to talk about faith in that way, in a more creative way. There are certain issues we need to take a much closer look at, and we need to be able to talk about without going into the neighborhood of religion. So overall, I would say, I think personally, I feel closer to agnosticism, but also to that kind of, to those mystics who were a little bit of misfits, walking a thin line between faith and doubt, and asking questions, difficult questions. I'm also interested in that tradition that unfortunately has been erased, censored, and suppressed to a large extent.
So another question that we've had from several people was sort of about advice from aspiring writers. And several people asked about that, but particularly from Adanya said, as an aspiring writer of colour, I would love to know, how do you stay true to your sense of imagination while balancing the need to tell marginalised or forgotten stories well? And do you worry about your work being seen as representative, or yourself being seen as speaking for, minority categories you represent, like Turkish women?
Yes, I do worry about that. And I think this is a label that we need to constantly fight against, because we should not be pigeonholed. I think literature is not about that. And I don't like identity politics in literature. And there's a lot of that going on. So, for instance, we do not expect an Afghan woman writer to write avant-garde or experimental fiction. We want an Afghan woman writer to write about Afghan women, right? And maybe in one book she's going to do that, but maybe her next book is going to be something completely different. Maybe she's going to come up with a dystopia that takes place in Norway. She can. So for me, can you write the stories of someone else? Yes, of course you can, because literature is not about identity, and we all contain multitudes inside. I think we should not forget that. One of the things that over the years progressive movements have abandoned, when you compare it with the progressive movements of 1960s and 70s, is this emphasis on multiplicity. I think particularly 1960s and 70s African American women's movement did this incredibly well. So when you read people like Audre Lorde, who left a big impact on me, she says, look at me, I'm black, I'm a woman, I'm a poet, I'm lesbian, I'm this, I'm that, and I'm many more things that you might not be able to see at first glance. So there's always that emphasis that there are layers, multiple selves inside. When you look at the progressive movements of previous decades, especially African American women's movement, because they were women, they were on the receiving end of sexism. Because they were black, they were on the receiving end of racism. Because many of them came from disempowered communities, they knew how class hierarchy and privilege worked. And because many of them were LGBTQ, they knew how homophobia and transphobia worked. So when they talk about power, they talk about power in a much more nuanced way than we tend to do today. And I think we shouldn't forget that. And the reason why I mention all this is because we can have multiple interests. Now, the only thing is, if we're writing about a subject that is not directly related, let's say, to our identity, we really, really need to pay so much more attention to it. We need to honor our subject. A lot of not only study and research, but emotional connection is needed. And eventually the reader will know if you've been able to connect emotionally or not. But to categorically say, because it's not your identity, you cannot write about that subject, is wrong. I think literature is about transcending all those boundaries. So the little advice that I can give to maybe younger writers is, if you feel it inside, I think it's all about the heart. It's a work of heart. It's a labor of love. Go for it. Don't worry about what other people might say or do. That's not important. What really matters is how the story speaks to your heart.
Thank you. So another question we've got, you sort of already touched on that, and I imagine for a writer this is pretty open-ended, but is from Sophie, which books or authors inspire you? I mean, you just mentioned Audre Lorde, who I know you've mentioned before, but I don't know if there's maybe one sort of historical book and something you're reading now, or an author you're sort of following at the moment. Maybe you could sort of let us know what's. I mean, I can see you've got an amazing bookshelf behind you.
During lockdown, the first part of the lockdown, I was reading mostly nonfiction because I was judging George Orwell Prize this year for political writing, and that was an amazing journey. I mean, all the books that we have read are long lists, then the fabulous short list. But I do both. I mean, of course, as a novelist, my primary love and passion is fiction. And I do feel very sad when I sometimes hear people say, I have no time for fiction. I read important stuff. I read politics, history, economy, but I don't do fiction. I hear this a lot, sometimes from male readers. And it really, really makes me sad, because how can we divide it into artificial categories like this. Fiction is about life. Anything that is part of life can be the subject of fiction. And I don't know a single person, whether we're a dentist or designer, engineer, teacher, student, I don't know a single person who doesn't need emotional intelligence and empathy. And fiction nurtures that. So my love for fiction is very deep. But I also love all kinds of nonfiction. I love reading neuroscience, for instance, even though I know nothing about the subject. There's a question that I ask myself. You know, many of us got so many things wrong, whether it was the Arab Spring, the financial crisis, Euro crisis, Brexit, Trump happened. Imagine, people who knew their subjects very well got many things wrong. And part of the reason is because we're so atomized. We do know our own disciplines, our own readings, but we don't necessarily connect the dots. So I think it's better for the mind if we have across the board readings. To me, it's much more interesting when a poet becomes interested in, for instance, political science, when a political scientist becomes interested in film theory, or when a director becomes interested in neuroscience. So when we have conversations with literature that is beyond our own field, those are the things that challenge us most. And I like to read, I think, both fiction and nonfiction. As long as it speaks to me in that moment of time, I don't make those artificial distinctions.
And I mean, this sort of fits in with what you were talking about, sort of the need for emotional empathy. A question from Daisy, who's saying you're a passionate advocate for women's and LGBTQ rights. How important do you think creativity and storytelling is in the fight for social change and for greater equality, diversity, and inclusion?
I think it's a very big part of the fight of the resistance. And also, if I may add this, we need to remember that most of the darkest chapters in human history, when you think about them, it didn't start with mass graves. It didn't start with putting crosses on the houses of neighbors just because they were of a different ethnicity or religion. It didn't start with gas chambers or concentration camps. It starts with language. It starts with words, discrimination. And I think it's very important that the resistance against discrimination also starts with words and with stories. Storytelling in that regard is political. One of the many wonderful things that we have learned from feminisms of past generations is that politics is not only about the parliament, it's not only about party politics, it's broader than that. Wherever there's power, there's politics. So in that regard, the personal is also political. So I find it very important that by telling different stories, we resist and understand the transformative power of storytelling. We also need to bear in mind that most of the time, discrimination goes hand in hand with dehumanization. If you can dehumanize groups of people, after that you can do anything. So literature has to rehumanize, and that is a political act, in my opinion. In other words, I think we live in an age in which none of us can afford to be apolitical or disengaged or indifferent.
In terms of not being disengaged, we have a sort of question that sort of very much follows on that from Dilara, who asks, what can Turkish women like us do from the countries we live in, so I guess she's outside Turkey, to support the cause our sisters are fighting for, to end and get justice for femicides in Turkey? I often am enraged, but rarely know what to do or how I can become active.
Yeah, Dilara, I thank you so much for this question. I think it's very important to keep this global solidarity and global sisterhood alive. And there are different ways of putting pressure on governments and giving support to grassroots movements in various countries. There are many women in Turkey. The fact that it's a patriarchal country doesn't mean the women are weak, doesn't mean women don't raise their voices, just the opposite. There are many Turkish, Kurdish, Armenian, Jewish, Greek women in Turkey, Alevi women who are raising their voices. And I think we need to support them. We can do that in so many different ways, whether it's social media, journalism, raising funds, supporting campaigns, making it visible, vocal, and sending letters to governments, putting pressure on politicians, especially at critical crossroads like this. There's so much we can do as active citizens. The worst, I think, would be numbness. And maybe that's the one thing that we need to be cautious of, not to remain disconnected and not to be numb towards the stories or pains of other people. As long as we're connected and we keep this momentum alive, because I think it is a movement. It's not a passing moment in time. We will be able to make progress, but it's a long way. And also we need to bear in mind that this is almost like a patriarchal backlash. When you gain a step, when you go a step forward, there's always a patriarchal backlash. So we need to be ready for that backlash as well. And we need to keep talking, keep moving, and keep working together.
From Tracy, we've got a question. How does the response to your books, positive and negative, affect you? And from sort of related to that, from Sophia Williams, how has the novel been received in Turkey? I mean, we know how the authorities received it by opening an investigation into obscenity, but I guess she probably means readers and sort of the general public. What beyond that particular government response? What sort of response have you had?
One thing I've learned over the years is to make a very clear-cut distinction in my mind between the elite and the people. And so from the elite and authorities and the government and the cultural elite as well, you can get all kinds of nasty things, personal attacks, because unfortunately in Turkey we don't have a tradition of literary criticism. We attack personally writers, but don't talk about their books. That's the kind of slander that is constantly happening. You need to make a distinction between that and the sincere feedback that comes from readers. And to me, it's the second that really matters. And maybe the same thing is happening in India, in Pakistan, but I can tell you, in Turkey, a book is not a personal item. If a reader likes a book, if she or he enjoys a book, she passes it on. She gives it to her best friend, and the best friend reads it and shares it with her cousin, or the cousin gives it to the mother. And to me, that word of mouth is incredibly important. I've seen this many times when people bring me books to sign. Different sentences have been underlined by different colored pens because more than one person has read the same copy. And I think in countries where democracy is crushed and the civil society is crushed and the publishing industry is suffering, if novels and if books are still alive, we owe it to a large extent to those readers who keep books alive by sharing them. And that part to me is very important and it's incredibly heartwarming. So how are my books received? It depends on which side you're looking at. From the elite, I get a lot of nastiness, but really from the readers, I've always had a very heartwarming connection over the years.
And I suppose also you could say that books, in places where you have controls on freedom of the press, on political freedoms, creeping authoritarianism, art, literature become more important as sort of sites of resistance, as ways of giving people visions of a different future or a different way of running things. No, I mean they become, you see often in places like that, literature can become more important to people in their lives.
Yeah, absolutely, and I don't think that's a coincidence. Storytelling is maybe one of our last democratic spaces, open spaces, and it has that kind of power. Also in societies that are bitterly politicized and divided into tribes, countries where people do not necessarily talk to each other or break bread together anymore. Maybe storytelling is one of the last remaining spaces where people of different views and backgrounds can nevertheless unite or come together. And to me, that's important. If I may add this, I have many readers in Turkey who are quite xenophobic, to be honest, because they grew up with a certain narrative. So you go to school and you swallow this nationalistic interpretation of history. At home, in the neighborhood, at school, And if you ask their opinions about Armenians, Greeks, Jews, Alevis, Kurds, because these are the main minorities in Turkey, they will tell you all kinds of stereotypes. But then the same people come and they say, you know, I read your book and it was this character that I love the most. And maybe the character they're talking about is Jewish or Greek. Equally, I have many readers who are homophobic or transphobic because they grew up in that way. This is the only narrative they have heard. But again, they come and they say, I cried when this character was hurt. And maybe the character they're talking about is bisexual or transgender or gay. So I really thought about this for a long time. How is it possible that people who are more judgmental in their daily life, in the public space, they're a little bit less judgmental or ready to connect with their other when they are reading a novel? And I don't think that's a coincidence, because we go inside, we go to an inner garden when we're reading a story. Suddenly we're not affected by the energies of the people around us. That's incredibly important. And again, it's not a coincidence that fascism, authoritarianism, totalitarianism, they all require synchronized collectivistic energy. People chanting, you know, you have to synchronize the energy of more than one person. So I think literature swims against that current because it opens an individual path to ourselves, not in a selfish way, but hopefully in a way that makes it possible for us to connect with the rest of humanity. And I find that incredibly important and maybe much needed at this moment in time.
Going back to sort of broader political issues, we've got a question from Ken Coelho asking if you've talked before about the sort of tide of authoritarianism, the rise of this, you know, particularly in sort of Western countries that used to consider themselves solid, that have realised they too are vulnerable to democracy being eroded, to the rise of demagoguery. Do you think that if Trump is voted out in November, could that be the beginning of a tide receding, a tide in a direction that would be more positive, of a sort of a return to stronger democratic values?
I wish I could say it will be that easy. Of course, I very much want Trump to lose, but I cannot be confident that when he loses, hopefully, it's going to be the beginning of the rise of liberal democracy, because we need to understand that the rise of populism did not happen in a vacuum. There was a background that encouraged it. In other words, populist right today, or populism in general, is, in my opinion, a fake answer to some very real problems. The problems are real, and the problems are there, and they're not going to disappear. And we need to face these problems. We need to talk about inequality. We need to tackle inequality. I think inequality is actually plural, cannot be a footnote from now on. We can't postpone it. We can't see it as a secondary issue. It is urgent that we pay attention to inequalities. Otherwise, we will see more and more populist movements. And it's happening everywhere, across Europe, across the world. We're seeing in India the rise of populist nationalism. We're seeing it in Brazil. So we need to understand what is triggering all these movements. And I think sometimes when I hear people saying, when are we going to go back to the way things were before the pandemic? I really don't want to go back to that world. Because was it really normal, that world? Is that the world we want to revive? I believe we need to see this as a starting point. My worry is, with the pandemic and with the repercussions, we're going to see a deepening of inequalities. And this is going to affect women more. It's going to affect minorities more. It's going to affect immigrants more. The already vulnerable and disempowered communities are going to be affected even more. So it is very crucial that we talk about inequalities of all kinds at this moment in time. Otherwise, we might see another Trump in the coming years coming up.
So a question perhaps in response to that quite sobering comment that you just made. Given we're in this time of, health, political, social crises, what makes you still hopeful? What do you hold on to for hope?
You know, sometimes I jokingly say I can't be very optimistic because I'm Turkish. It's not in my genes. I think it's not in my DNA. When you look at the map of Europe, if you trace the river Danube, the blue Danube, with your finger, as your finger moves from Germany towards the Black Sea, you will see the level of optimism drop. So by the time you reach Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, the Black Sea, Turkey, we're not very optimistic cultures. But that aside, I think I have both. I have both pessimism and optimism. I've mentioned this before, but I like what Gramsci used to talk about. He used to talk about the pessimism of the mind, pessimism of the intellect, which I think is a good thing. And we need to keep it alive because it helps us to be more alert and more aware of what's happening in the world. But too much pessimism also weighs us down. So we also need the optimism of the will or optimism of the heart. And we need both at this moment in time. And I believe the optimism that we need will come from our fellow human beings. When you look at Beirut, you know, how completely devastated, and you speak with people and you see the resilience, and that kind of shames us because, you know, how can we complain? Look what people are going through. Their resilience, their courage teaches us as human beings. I think we always learn from each other. So yes, politics will make us more pessimistic and will demoralize us. And part of it is okay because we need to be more aware. But on the other hand, the optimism that we need is definitely going to come from our fellow human beings and from connections that go beyond borders.
And just so, I think we're into our final question. I think there's one that sort of fits very well with that from Abdurrahman, who asked, when are you going to write a new book and when will we be able to read it? So I think the book that you have coming out at the end of this month is How to Stay Sane in an Age of
Division. Yes, that booklet is coming out this month, How to Stay Sane in an Age of Division. And in a way, it's like a manifesto that talks about all the questions that weigh on our hearts at this moment in time, and also the negative feelings that we're coping with, whether it's anxiety, anger, fear, resentment, but it also talks about the danger of numbness. So that booklet is coming out soon, and hopefully the new novel I'm working on. When I finish a novel, I don't immediately start the new one. I think I have a pendulum. I like to listen. I believe writers need to be two things primarily. We need to be good readers and good listeners. So I try to listen to what people are saying, but also how they're saying what they're saying, with what kind of energy. I take lots of notes. I observe, I read, I wait, and then I start the new novel.
Well, I think that's a perfect note to end on. I know we're all very, very keen for you to either get started or if you've got started to make good progress. And we're already looking forward to the next novel as well as the manifesto for getting through these strange times. But thank you so very much, Elif, for such a fascinating hour. It's been brilliant. And thank you so much to all the audience for joining us from all around the world. If you have a couple of minutes, we would be incredibly grateful if you would fill out the survey, which will pop up when you exit the event, just about how you found it, to make sure we can keep these as relevant and enjoyable as possible. And you can find out about other upcoming online events at theguardian.com/Guardian Live. We've got events coming up with Matt Hay, Jutta Martelengi, and for those who want more political gloom, a discussion on Are We Heading to a No-Deal Brexit? So hope to see some of you there. Thank you very much again to everyone, especially, of course, Elif. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you so much, Emma.
Goodbye.